The aroma of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort in the bustling diner. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating the polished counter and the worn vinyl booths. Elijah, a young man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, moved through the crowded space with practiced ease. His movements were fluid, a silent ballet of efficiency as he navigated the maze of tables, balancing trays laden with steaming plates and mugs. He wore his uniform, a crisp white shirt and dark pants, with a quiet pride, despite the constant pressure of the busy lunchtime rush. He knew the regulars, their usual orders memorized, their preferences ingrained in his memory. There was Mrs. Gable, who always ordered the blueberry pancakes with extra syrup, and Mr. Fitzwilliam, who preferred his coffee black and strong, served in a chipped mug he'd been using for years. He knew the rhythm of the diner, the ebb and flow of customers, the predictable chaos that somehow always resolved itself into a smooth, efficient operation. He'd worked at the diner for 3 years, long enough to feel a sense of ownership, a quiet satisfaction in the smooth functioning of this small, chaotic world. He hummed softly to himself, a low melody almost lost in the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations. He enjoyed the work, the interaction with people, the feeling of being useful, of contributing to the smooth running of this small corner of the city. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't high-paying, but it was honest work, and for Elijah, that was enough. He had bigger dreams, of course, dreams that stretched beyond the confines of the diner, dreams that he kept tucked away in the quiet spaces of his mind, nurtured in the late hours of the night when the city slept and the world outside was hushed. Today, however, the usual rhythm of the diner felt slightly off-kilter. There was a tension in the air, a palpable energy that buzzed beneath the surface of the usual lunchtime bustle. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of unease that prickled at the edges of his awareness. He chalked it up to the usual Friday rush, the heightened energy that always seemed to accompany the end of the workweek. He served a table of businessmen, their loud laughter echoing through the diner, their conversation a jumble of incomprehensible jargon. He refilled coffee cups, delivered plates of eggs and bacon, wiped down tables with practiced efficiency. He smiled politely at the customers, offering a quiet word of greeting or farewell, his movements precise and unhurried. He was a master of his craft, a silent observer in the midst of the daily drama unfolding around him. He was used to the hustle and bustle, the demands of the job, the occasional spilled coffee or dropped plate. He was a professional, and he handled everything with quiet grace. He even managed to maintain his composure when a particularly demanding customer complained about the temperature of his coffee, his voice rising to a sharp pitch. Elijah listened patiently, offering a sincere apology and replacing the coffee with a fresh, steaming mug. He handled the situation with practiced ease, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the customer's agitated state. He was used to dealing with difficult customers, used to the occasional outburst of frustration or anger. He knew how to navigate these situations, how to diffuse the tension, how to maintain his composure in the face of adversity. He had developed a thick skin, a resilience born from years of navigating a world that often seemed determined to test his patience. He had learned to let the negativity roll off him like water off a duck's back, to focus on the positive aspects of his job, to find satisfaction in the small victories, the quiet moments of connection with his customers. He was, after all, a master of his craft, a silent guardian of the diner's peace. He was Elijah, and he was ready for anything, or so he thought. The diner continued its frenetic pace, a whirlwind of activity that seemed to intensify with each passing minute. Elijah moved through the chaos with practiced ease, a silent observer amidst the storm of clattering plates and boisterous conversations. He was in the zone, his movements fluid and efficient, his mind focused on the task at hand. He was a machine, a well-oiled cog in the diner's intricate mechanism, seamlessly navigating the demands of the busy lunchtime rush. He felt a quiet satisfaction in his efficiency, a sense of accomplishment in his ability to handle the pressure with grace and composure. Then he saw him, Mr. Henderson, a regular, but one Elijah always approached with a degree of caution. Mr. Henderson was known for his gruff demeanor, his impatience, his tendency to complain about even the smallest of things. He was a man who seemed perpetually dissatisfied, a walking embodiment of negativity. Elijah had learned to tread carefully around Mr. Henderson, to anticipate his needs, to anticipate his complaints, to navigate the minefield of his moods with careful precision. Mr. Henderson sat at his usual booth, a solitary figure in a rumpled suit, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked even grumpier than usual, his face a mask of discontent, his brow furrowed in a permanent frown. Elijah approached his table with a practiced smile, his heart already beginning to sink. He knew this was going to be a difficult interaction. "More coffee, Mr. Henderson?" Elijah asked, his voice carefully modulated, his tone polite and respectful. Mr. Henderson grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in his cup. He didn't meet Elijah's gaze, his silence heavy with unspoken displeasure. Elijah waited patiently, giving Mr. Henderson the space he seemed to crave, the silence stretching out into an uncomfortable void. "Yes," Mr. Henderson finally mumbled, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. "And make it snappy." Elijah nodded silently, turning to refill the coffee pot. He moved quickly, efficiently, his movements precise and unhurried. He returned to Mr. Henderson's table with a fresh cup of coffee, carefully placing it on the table. He waited for a moment, giving Mr. Henderson a chance to react. Mr. Henderson took a sip of his coffee, then slammed the cup down on the table with surprising force. The sound startled Elijah, the sudden noise jarring in the otherwise bustling diner. "This is lukewarm," Mr. Henderson complained, his voice laced with irritation. "Absolutely lukewarm. Do you people even know how to make coffee around here?" Elijah's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I apologize, sir," he said, his voice calm and even. "I'll get you a fresh cup." "A fresh cup?" Mr. Henderson scoffed. "That's all you've got to say? This is unacceptable. I expect better service than this." Elijah felt a prickle of irritation, but he fought it down, reminding himself to maintain his professionalism. He was used to dealing with difficult customers, used to the occasional outburst of frustration. He knew how to navigate these situations, how to diffuse the tension, how to maintain his composure in the face of adversity. He was, after all, a master of his craft. He turned to get another cup of coffee, his movements precise and efficient, his mind racing to find a way to appease the disgruntled customer. He knew that Mr. Henderson was a difficult man, a man prone to outbursts, a man who seemed to find fault in everything. But Elijah was determined to handle the situation with grace and professionalism, to maintain his composure in the face of the brewing storm. He was, after all, a professional, and he knew how to handle difficult customers. Or so he thought. The situation, however, was about to take a far more sinister turn. Elijah returned with a fresh cup of coffee, his hand steady despite the tremor of unease that had begun to settle in his stomach. He placed the cup before Mr. Henderson, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. He braced himself, waiting for the inevitable explosion. He had dealt with Mr. Henderson's grumpiness before, but there was something different about him today, a sharper edge to his irritation, a darker undercurrent to his complaints. Mr. Henderson didn't even look at the coffee. Instead, he stared at Elijah, his eyes narrowed, his gaze intense and unsettling. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, the only sound the low hum of the diner's activity. Elijah waited, his patience wearing thin, his composure beginning to crack under the weight of Mr. Henderson's scrutiny. "You know," Mr. Henderson finally said, his voice low and menacing, "I've been watching you." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He had never experienced this kind of hostility from a customer before. He had always been able to diffuse tense situations with his calm demeanor, his professional approach. But this was different. This felt personal. "I've been watching you," Mr. Henderson repeated, his voice rising in volume, fumbling around, spilling things, making mistakes. "You're clumsy. You're slow. He paused, searching for the right word, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "Incompetent." Elijah remained silent, his jaw clenched, his body rigid. He felt a wave of anger wash over him, but he fought it down, reminding himself to remain calm, to remain professional. He had to maintain his composure, no matter what. And you know what else? Mr. Henderson continued, his voice dripping with venom. You're a... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, savoring the moment, the power he held over Elijah. A slave. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a poisonous dart aimed directly at Elijah's heart. The blood drained from Elijah's face, his body trembling slightly. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a sense of disbelief and betrayal. He had never been called that before, not in this way, not with such malice and intent. The other diners in the diner seemed to freeze, their conversations dying down, their eyes drawn to the scene unfolding before them. The air crackled with tension, a palpable sense of unease hanging heavy in the atmosphere. Elijah felt the weight of their gazes, the silent judgment, the unspoken condemnation. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his face inches from Elijah's. You hear me, boy? He hissed, his voice a low growl. You don't belong here. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the diner, shattering the fragile peace. He grabbed his coffee cup, the lukewarm liquid sloshing inside, and hurled it at Elijah. The hot coffee splashed across Elijah's face and chest, burning his skin, searing his flesh. A gasp rippled through the diner, a collective intake of breath, a silent acknowledgement of the violence that had just transpired. Elijah stood there, stunned, his body trembling, the hot coffee burning his skin, the racist slur burning his soul. He felt the sting of the coffee, the sting of the words, the sting of the humiliation. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, the crushing weight of racism, of prejudice, of injustice. He felt defeated, broken, utterly alone. But even in that moment of profound pain and humiliation, he knew he had to maintain his composure. He had to find a way to survive this. He had to find a way to endure. The silence that followed the assault was deafening. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, the usual cacophony of the diner, all vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. All eyes were on Elijah, a mixture of shock, horror, and disbelief etched on the faces of the other patrons. Some looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to the blatant racism and violence that had just unfolded. Others stared, frozen in place, unable to comprehend the scene before them. A few whispered amongst themselves, their hushed tones a stark contrast to the explosive outburst that had preceded the silence. Elijah stood motionless, the scalding coffee burning his skin, the racist slur echoing in his ears. He felt the sting of the hot liquid, the searing pain of physical manifestation of the emotional trauma he was enduring. He could feel the stares of the other diners, the weight of their judgment, the silent condemnation of his silent suffering. He felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly alone. Yet, amidst the chaos and the pain, a strange calm settled over him. A quiet resolve hardened his resolve. He would not give Mr. Henderson the satisfaction of seeing him break. He slowly reached for a nearby napkin, his movements deliberate, controlled. He dabbed at the coffee on his skin, the cool cloth offering a small measure of comfort against the burning sensation. He did not flinch, did not cry out, did not react in any way that would give Mr. Henderson the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He remained standing, his body rigid, his expression impassive. He was a statue, a monument to silent resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Mr. Henderson, meanwhile, sat back in his booth, a smug look spreading across his face. He seemed pleased with himself, satisfied with the damage he had inflicted. He had unleashed his anger, his prejudice, his hatred, and he had gotten away with it. Or so he thought. Elijah finished cleaning himself as best he could with the napkin, the stinging sensation a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured. He then turned to the other patrons, his gaze sweeping across their faces. He saw shame, guilt, and regret in some of their eyes, a recognition of their own complicity in allowing such an incident to occur. He saw fear in others, a fear of confronting the racism that had just been so openly displayed. And he saw indifference in the eyes of a few, a chilling detachment that chilled him to the bone. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that threatened to consume him. But he suppressed it, reminding himself that giving in to anger would only play into Mr. Henderson's hands. He would not give him the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He would not give him the power to define his response. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah turned and walked away from the table, leaving Mr. Henderson sitting alone in his booth, a triumphant smirk on his face. He walked towards the back of the diner, his movements measured, his steps steady. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the stares of the other patrons, didn't allow himself to be consumed by the humiliation he had just endured. He simply walked away, his back ramrod straight, his head held high, his resolve unshaken. He was leaving the scene, but he was not defeated. He was merely regrouping, preparing for the next battle. He was, after all, more than just a waiter in a diner. He was a survivor. He was resilient. He was Elijah, and he would not be broken. The back room of the diner was small, cramped, and dimly lit. The air hung heavy with the scent of cleaning supplies and frying grease, a stark contrast to the bright, bustling atmosphere of the main dining area. Elijah entered the room, closing the door behind him, seeking refuge from the turmoil he had just endured. He leaned against the cool tile wall, his body trembling slightly, the residual heat of the coffee still burning his skin. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, trying to regain control of his emotions. He looked around the small room, his gaze settling on the various cleaning supplies neatly arranged on a shelf. A mop, a bucket, sponges, and a bottle of disinfectant stood ready for their next task. He reached for a clean cloth, his fingers tracing the rough texture of the fabric. The simple act of touching the cloth, of feeling its familiar texture, grounded him, brought him back to the present moment. It was a small act, a simple gesture, but it was enough to restore a sense of calm, a sense of control. He began to clean the burns on his arms and chest, the cool water offering a small measure of relief from the searing pain. He worked methodically, his movements precise and unhurried, his mind focused on the task at hand. The act of cleaning, of restoring order to his physical self, was a way of restoring order to his emotional self. It was a way of reclaiming his dignity, of asserting his control over his own body, his own emotions. He thought back to the incident, replaying it in his mind, analyzing his response, searching for any flaws, any mistakes. He had remained calm. He had not reacted violently. He had not allowed Mr. Henderson's racism to provoke him into a confrontation. He had done what he could to protect himself, to protect his dignity, to maintain his composure. He had survived, but the memory of Mr. Henderson's words, the hateful slur, still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the prejudice he faced, the racism he endured. It was a constant battle, a daily struggle, a fight against a system that was designed to keep him down, to keep him silent, to keep him invisible. He had been fighting this battle for years, a battle against indifference, against ignorance, against hatred. And he was tired. He finished cleaning the burns, his movements now more deliberate, more purposeful. He had to get back to work, to face the customers, to navigate the chaos of the diner. He had a job to do, a responsibility to fulfill. He couldn't afford to let Mr. Henderson's actions derail him, to allow his hatred to dictate his actions. He had to remain strong, to remain resilient, to remain focused on his goals. He took another deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. He would not let Mr. Henderson win. He would not let his hatred define him. He would not allow his racism to break him. He would continue to work, to serve, to live his life with dignity and grace. He would continue to fight for his rights, for his dignity, for his future. He would not be silenced. He would not be defeated. He would endure. He would persevere. He would overcome. He was Elijah, and he would not be broken. He would rise above the ashes of Mr. Henderson's hatred, stronger, more determined, more resilient than ever before. He would find a way to turn this pain into purpose. He would find a way to turn this humiliation into triumph. He would find a way to transform this defeat into victory. The rest of the lunch rush was a blur. Elijah moved through the motions, his body acting on autopilot, his mind elsewhere. The usual rhythm of the diner, the familiar sounds and smells, felt distant, unreal. He served customers refilled coffee cups, cleared tables, his movements mechanical, his interactions perfunctory. He was a ghost, a shadow moving through the bustling space, his presence barely registered by the oblivious diners. He felt the lingering sting of the coffee, the phantom burn, a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured. He could still hear Mr. Henderson's words, the hateful slur echoing in his ears, a constant barrage of negativity assaulting his senses. He felt the weight of the other diners' stares, their silent judgment, their unspoken condemnation. He felt isolated, alone, adrift in a sea of indifference. But beneath the surface of his outward composure, a quiet fire burned, a simmering anger, a righteous fury, fueled by years of enduring racism, of battling prejudice, of fighting for his dignity. It was a fire that he kept carefully banked, carefully controlled, but it was there, smoldering beneath the ashes of his outward calm. He finished his shift in a daze, his body aching, his mind exhausted. He changed out of his uniform, the crisp white shirt now stained with coffee, a visible testament to the violence he had endured. He felt the weight of the day, the weight of the incident, the weight of the racism he had faced. It was a heavy burden, a constant companion, a shadow that followed him everywhere. He walked home in silence, his steps heavy, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, analyzing his response, searching for ways he could have handled the situation differently. He had remained calm. He had not retaliated. He had not allowed Mr. Henderson to provoke him into a confrontation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he could have done more, that he could have fought back harder, that he could have made his voice heard. He arrived home, his small apartment a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. He showered, the hot water washing away the physical remnants of the day, but not the emotional scars. He changed into comfortable clothes, his body aching, his mind exhausted. He sat on his couch, staring out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, a sense of hopelessness that threatened to consume him. He had endured so much, fought so hard, but it seemed as though nothing had changed. The racism, the prejudice, the hatred, it was all still there, a constant threat, a pervasive presence in his life. He wondered if it would ever end, if he would ever escape the cycle of violence and oppression. But then, amidst the despair, a spark of defiance ignited within him. He would not give up. He would not be defeated. He would continue to fight, to resist, to endure. He would find a way to channel his anger, his pain, his frustration into something positive, something constructive. He would find a way to use his experiences to inspire others, to educate others, to make a difference in the world. He would find a way to turn his pain into purpose. He would find a way to transform his suffering into strength. He would find a way to overcome. He would not be silenced. He would not be broken. He was Elijah, and he would not be defeated. He would rise again, stronger, more determined, more resilient. He would prevail. The following days were a blur of routine. Elijah went through the motions of his life, his work at the diner a monotonous cycle of serving customers, cleaning tables, and enduring the occasional pointed stare or whispered comment. He avoided eye contact with most people, his usual easy smile replaced with a guarded expression. The incident with Mr. Henderson had left a deep scar, a wound that festered beneath the surface of his outward composure. He felt a constant sense of unease, a hypervigilance that made even the simplest interactions feel fraught with tension. He found himself replaying the events of that day over and over in his mind, analyzing his responses, searching for ways he could have handled the situation differently. He had chosen not to retaliate, not to engage in a confrontation, but the decision gnawed at him. Had he been too passive, too accommodating? Had he allowed Mr. Henderson to get away with his racism, his violence, his hatred? The questions haunted him, a constant source of self-doubt and frustration. He found solace in his writing. Late at night, after the diner closed and the city fell silent, he would sit at his small desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pouring his emotions onto the page. He wrote about his experiences, his struggles, his triumphs, his frustrations. He wrote about the racism he faced, the prejudice he endured, the constant battle against indifference and ignorance. He wrote about his dreams, his aspirations, his hopes for a better future. His writing became his therapy, his escape, his refuge. It was a way of processing his emotions, of making sense of his experiences, of finding meaning in his suffering. It was a way of reclaiming his voice, of asserting his identity, of expressing his truth. He wrote with a raw honesty, a visceral intensity, pouring his heart and soul onto the page. He wrote about the pain, the anger, the frustration, but also about the resilience, the hope, the determination that burned within him. He had been writing for years, keeping journals, crafting short stories, exploring his creativity in the quiet hours of the night. But this time felt different. This time his writing felt more urgent, more necessary, more powerful. This time he was writing not just for himself, but for others. He was writing to share his story, to give voice to the voiceless, to inspire others to fight for justice, for equality, for a better world. He wrote about the diner, about Mr. Henderson, about the other customers, about the silent witnesses who had watched him suffer without intervening. He wrote about the racism he had endured, not just that day, but throughout his life. He wrote about the subtle indignities, the microaggressions, the constant feeling of being othered, of being marginalized, of being judged. He wrote about the resilience he had developed, the strength he had found within himself to endure. He wrote about his dreams, his hopes, his unwavering belief in a better future. He wrote with a passion and intensity that surprised even himself. He was writing his truth, and in doing so, he was finding his purpose. He was finding his voice. He was finding his power. Weeks turned into months. Elijah continued to work at the diner, the routine a dull ache in the background of his life. The incident with Mr. Henderson remained a raw wound, a constant reminder of the pervasive racism he faced. He still felt the phantom burn of the coffee, the sting of the hateful words. But something had shifted within him. The anger, once a simmering fire, had begun to coalesce, to solidify into a focused determination. His writing had become his refuge, his therapy, his weapon. He had poured his heart and soul into his manuscript, crafting a powerful narrative that explored his experiences with racism, his struggles, and his triumphs. He wrote about the small indignities, the microaggressions, the constant feeling of being othered, of being marginalized, of being judged. He wrote about the larger acts of violence, the overt displays of hatred, the moments when he felt utterly alone and vulnerable. He wrote about his resilience, his determination, his unwavering belief in a better future. He had initially written for himself, a way of processing his emotions, of making sense of his experiences. But as he wrote, he realized that his story was not just his own. It was a story shared by countless others, a story that needed to be told, a story that needed to be heard. He began to see his writing as a form of activism, a way of raising awareness, of challenging prejudice, of inspiring change. He sent his manuscript to several publishers, bracing himself for rejection. He knew that his story was not an easy one, that it dealt with difficult and uncomfortable themes. But he also knew that it was an important story, a story that needed to be told. He was determined to share his experiences, to give voice to the voiceless, to inspire others to fight for justice, for equality, for a better world. The rejections came, as expected. Some were polite, some were dismissive, some were downright cruel. But Elijah persevered. He revised his manuscript, honed his craft, sharpened his message. He refused to be discouraged, to be silenced, to be defeated. He knew that his story was worth telling, that it had the power to make a difference. Then one day an email arrived. It was from a small, independent publisher, a publisher known for its commitment to social justice and diverse voices. They had read his manuscript, they had been moved by his story, and they wanted to publish it. The news was overwhelming, a wave of emotion washing over him. He felt a mixture of relief, joy, gratitude, and a sense of profound validation. His story, his truth, was finally going to be heard. He had fought for years to make his voice heard, to share his experiences, to inspire change. And now his dream was finally coming true. His manuscript was going to be published, and his story, would be shared with the world. He had turned his pain into purpose, his suffering into strength, his defeat into victory. He had overcome. He had prevailed. And he knew, with unwavering certainty, that his journey was far from over. His story was just beginning. The book launch was a whirlwind. Elijah, now a published author, found himself thrust into a world he had never imagined. He had spent years working in the anonymity of the diner, his life a quiet routine of serving customers and writing in the solitude of his small apartment. Now, he was surrounded by flashing cameras, eager reporters, and a throng of admirers. His book, A Seat at the Table, had become an unexpected bestseller, its powerful narrative resonating with readers across the country. The book signing was held in a large bookstore in the heart of the city. A long line of people snaked through the aisles, eager to meet the author, to get their copies signed, to hear his story. Elijah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He was nervous, unsure of how to handle the attention, the scrutiny, the expectations. But he was also determined to make the most of this opportunity, to use his platform to continue his fight for justice, for equality, for a better world. He sat at a table laden with copies of his book, his pen poised, ready to sign. He looked at the faces of the people in line, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. He saw hope in their eyes, a desire for connection, a yearning for change. He felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of purpose, a renewed determination to use his voice to make a difference. He signed books, one after another, each signature a small act of connection, a shared moment of understanding. He listened to the stories of his readers, their experiences echoing his own, their struggles mirroring his own. He heard tales of racism, of prejudice, of discrimination, stories that affirmed his own experiences, stories that validated his own pain. But he also heard stories of resilience, of hope, of determination, stories that inspired him, stories that renewed his faith in humanity. He spoke with readers, answered their questions, shared his thoughts and feelings. He talked about his experiences at the diner, about Mr. Henderson, about the racism he had endured. He talked about his writing, about his process, about his hopes for the future. He spoke with passion, with intensity, with a raw honesty that moved his audience. He shared his vulnerability, his pain, his struggles, but he also shared his strength, his resilience, his unwavering belief in a better world. He realized that his book was more than just a story. It was a catalyst for change, a platform for dialogue, a beacon of hope. It had given voice to the voiceless, empowered the marginalized, and inspired countless others to fight for justice, for equality, for a better world. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose, a renewed determination to continue his work, to continue his fight. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he was ready. He was prepared. He was determined to make a difference. He was Elijah, and he would not be silenced. He would not be defeated. He would prevail. He was ready to face whatever came next, armed with his words, his story, and his unwavering belief in the power of truth. The book signing was a success beyond anything Elijah could have imagined. The line stretched out the door, winding through the bookstore and onto the sidewalk. News crews filmed the event, capturing the energy and excitement of the crowd. Elijah signed hundreds of books, each signature a small act of connection, a shared moment of understanding. He spoke with readers, answered their questions, shared his thoughts and feelings. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, a renewed sense of purpose. His story, his truth, was finally being heard. But amidst the excitement and celebration, a quiet dread lingered in the back of his mind. He knew that his success would not go unnoticed. He knew that Mr. Henderson, the man who had subjected him to such humiliation and violence, would eventually learn about his newfound fame. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He wondered how Mr. Henderson would react, what his response would be. Would he be remorseful? Angry? Vengeful? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant source of anxiety. He tried to push the thought aside, to focus on the positive aspects of his success. He had achieved his dream. He had shared his story. He had made a difference. But the fear remained, a persistent shadow lurking in the corners of his mind. He knew that confronting Mr. Henderson would be difficult, painful, and potentially dangerous. But he also knew that he couldn't avoid him forever. He had to face the man who had inflicted such pain upon him, the man who had tried to silence him, the man who had underestimated his resilience. He spent the days following the book's signing in a state of heightened anxiety. He checked the news, hoping to avoid any mention of Mr. Henderson, any sign of his reaction. He avoided going to the diner, fearing an unexpected encounter. He lived in a state of constant vigilance, his senses heightened, his nerves frayed. The success he had achieved felt bittersweet, tainted by the fear of what might come next. He knew that he couldn't live in fear. He couldn't allow Mr. Henderson's actions to dictate his life, to control his emotions, to limit his potential. He had come too far, fought too hard, achieved too much, to allow himself to be paralyzed by fear. He had to find a way to confront Mr. Henderson, to deal with the lingering trauma, to find closure. He had to face his past in order to move forward, to build a future free from the shadow of Mr. Henderson's hatred. He had to find a way to turn this fear into strength, this anxiety into action. He had to face his demons, and he knew, deep down, that he would. He was Elijah, and he would not be defeated. He would face whatever came next, armed with his words, his story, and his unwavering belief in the power of truth. He would prevail. The local newspaper ran a story about Elijah's book launch, a small article tucked away on a back page. It included a photograph of Elijah, smiling, surrounded by well-wishers, a stack of his books beside him. The caption read, "Local author's debut novel inspires readers." Elijah had almost missed it, tucked away as it was amongst the usual local news and sports updates. He hadn't even noticed it until his mother called, excitedly recounting the story and showing him the picture on her phone. It was a simple article, but it was enough. It was enough for Mr. Henderson to see. It was enough to set the stage for their inevitable confrontation. A week later, Elijah was invited to a small, intimate book signing at a local library. It was a much smaller event than the bookstore launch, a more intimate gathering of readers. He felt a sense of relief, a sense of calm, a sense of being back in control. He was surrounded by supportive readers, people who understood his story, people who appreciated his work. He felt a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of purpose. He was halfway through signing books when he saw him. Mr. Henderson stood near the back of the room, his face pale, his eyes wide. He looked lost, confused, almost frightened. He was dressed in his usual rumpled suit, but his usual air of arrogance and self-importance was gone. He looked small, insignificant, almost pathetic. Elijah felt a surge of anger, a wave of resentment, a flood of memories. He remembered the burning coffee, the hateful words, the humiliation, the pain. He wanted to turn away, to ignore him, to pretend he wasn't there. But he knew he couldn't. He had to face him, to confront him, to deal with the lingering trauma. He finished signing the book he was holding, then slowly, deliberately, walked towards Mr. Henderson. He felt the eyes of the other patrons on him, their silent support a source of strength. He approached Mr. Henderson, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Henderson didn't speak. He just stared at Elijah, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. He looked like a beaten dog, his usual arrogance replaced by a cowering fear. Elijah stopped in front of him, his gaze unwavering. He didn't say anything for a moment, allowing the silence to hang heavy in the air. He wanted Mr. Henderson to feel the weight of his actions, the impact of his words, the depth of his cruelty. Then quietly, calmly, he spoke. "I wrote that book," he said, his voice low and steady, "because of you." Mr. Henderson looked down at the floor, his face buried in his hands. He didn't speak, didn't offer an apology, didn't try to justify his actions. He simply stood there, a broken man, his silence a testament to the power of truth, the weight of his own guilt. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, a testament to the unspoken understanding between them. The weight of Mr. Henderson's actions and the quiet dignity of Elijah's response hung heavy in the air. It was a moment of profound reckoning, a moment of silent reconciliation. It was a moment of healing. It was a moment of justice. The encounter with Mr. Henderson at the library marked a turning point. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no physical altercation. It was a quiet moment of reckoning, a silent exchange of understanding. Mr. Henderson's shame was palpable, his silence a testament to the weight of his actions. Elijah, in turn, felt a sense of closure, a release from the burden he had carried for so long. The incident, though horrific, had become a catalyst for his success, a source of his strength. The story of their encounter spread quickly, whispered amongst the patrons at the library, shared on social media, picked up by local news outlets. It became another chapter in Elijah's narrative, a testament to his resilience, his forgiveness, his unwavering belief in the power of truth. His book sales soared even higher, propelled by the renewed interest in his story. He became a symbol of hope, a beacon of resilience, an inspiration to those who had faced similar struggles. Elijah used his newfound platform to advocate for social justice, to speak out against racism and prejudice, to promote understanding and empathy. He traveled the country, giving speeches, participating in panel discussions, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He became a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the marginalized, a leader in the fight for equality. He continued to work at the diner, but his perspective had changed. He no longer saw his job as simply a means to an end. He saw it as an opportunity to connect with people, to build relationships, to make a difference in his community. He treated every customer with respect, regardless of their background or beliefs. He saw his work as a form of activism, a way of challenging prejudice, of promoting understanding, of building bridges. He used his earnings from his book to support various social justice initiatives, donating to organizations that fought against racism and discrimination. He established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, ensuring that future generations would have the opportunity to pursue their dreams, regardless of their background. He became a mentor to young people, sharing his experiences, offering guidance, inspiring them to reach their full potential. He never forgot the incident with Mr. Henderson, but he didn't let it define him. He used it as a source of strength, a reminder of the importance of resilience, the power of forgiveness, the necessity of fighting for justice. He transformed his pain into purpose, his suffering into strength, his defeat into victory. He had overcome, he had prevailed, and he would continue to fight for a better world, a world where everyone had a seat at the table, a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. His story was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt dark and divided. It was a story of resilience, of forgiveness, and ultimately of triumph. It was Elijah's story, and it was just beginning.